In this video, we're going to talk about the differences between keys, extremes, breakdowns, and in-betweens, and the roles in your workflow. If you've never thought about these concepts before, this lesson is going to drastically improve the way you approach animation, so listen carefully. First of all, there is a certain order which you should build your poses, and this order is based on the hierarchy of importance, as you can see on the screen. In this lesson, we are going to analyze a clip from our cinematic and look for these poses. And in a later lesson, we will analyze an actual reference before we animate a shot. So you'll be able to practice doing this yourself. First, our key poses. These are the most important poses in your animation, and they're the storytelling poses because, well, you can't tell a story without them. As a beginner, it can be a bit confusing to know which poses are key poses. One way you can easily find them is by writing down a short description of what's happening in the shot. Now let's look at our scene to help explain this. We'll only be focusing on Max, so ignore May in the background. So here a brief description would be Max is about to pull a prank on May. He comes into the cockpit holding the camera, he's giddy but quiet so she doesn't notice him. He does a little quiet shh at the camera to show that we need to be quiet. Then he puts the camera down and frames May into view. Here he shows us the thumbs up, giggles, then creeps up behind May's chair. And then he blows his air horn right into her ear. May gets scared, falls off the chair. Max then goes to pick up the camera again, doing an excited yes gesture. As he gets up, he points the camera at May. May runs towards him angrily and knocks him into the ground. This is my favorite pose right here. Okay, so that's the description, and we wrote something similar when creating the script for the cinematic. You want to have all of the important storytelling beats covered, and all of these beats will be key poses. The first thing that you need to do, however, is to find the gold poses. Golden poses are the bare bones of the shot, describing the main actions happening in the story. You usually have one golden pose for each action because it helps you figure out the basic timing of the shot. I mark the golden poses with a circled yellow K, and I would always consider the very first pose to be a golden pose because we absolutely need to know where we are starting the shot off. So again, this will be our first golden pose, and now we're going to start going through them. Our second golden pose would be Max shushing the camera, then looking over at May, putting down the camera, stepping back and stopping behind the chair. We need the pose of him going backwards because otherwise we don't know how he got there. So here we're indicating that, oh, he started walking backwards to get to this position. So there's an extra pose in here to indicate that. Otherwise we wouldn't know if he tumbled, crawled, got up and walked, or whatnot. It just helps to clarify what's happening in the shot and in our scene. After that, Max gives us the thumbs up, turns away towards May, then reaches up over May to get ready to blow the air horn, blows the air horn, and then hides again. Afterwards he jumps, then does his little victory gesture, grabs the camera, gets up with it, points at May, gets slammed to the ground, and then the camera falls. So let me go back to the beginning. If I flip between them again without saying anything, you can still tell exactly what this shot is about. So let's go ahead and try that. I won't say anything and we're just going to flip through them. There we go. No words needed to be said. All we had to do was show our golden poses. And that is the exact reason for the golden poses. It's nothing complex, you're not doing any crazy animating, you're just creating the bare bones of the shot with these golden poses. Now having your golden poses isn't really enough to let the computer fill in the rest. We need to add a lot more information than that. One of the things you absolutely need to do is to add contact poses. This could be foot placements, hands touching surfaces, or grabbing objects, for example. Each one of these is where there is contact happening. This makes sense because as your character moves through space, you need to animate their steps in order to map out how they got from point A to point B and how they interact with the environment. I marked these in green just so we can see them clearly. I left out the ones we can't see properly just to simplify the explanation. But ideally, you'd shoot your reference from far enough where you can see your foot placements. And so I'm gonna start going through them. Our first key pose is frame 99. This is our first contact pose. Then we got 104. This is the other foot coming down. 142 when we're taking another step. 153. This is where the feet rotate. 219 where the screen right foot slides more to the left. Another contact happening. 227 where the screen left foot comes back this time and he's getting ready to go up. And then we have 282. This is after he was up and he already blew the air horn, and now his screen right foot is shifting back again. Next up is 308 here when he moves his foot. And then we have 328 where he jumps up and then lands in this area again. We just have two more key poses. The next one is here. Again, another foot position. And then lastly, we have 345, which is basically the final position before he raises the camera. So these were the key poses where contact was made. Next up, we need the keys for any other performance you want to capture in the shot. Now that's not the end. Next up, we need keys for any other performance you want to capture in the shot that hasn't been included yet. I made these keys red, so let's go through them. First off, we have frame 11. This is where Max's eyes dart from May to the camera, so it's important to set a key exactly where you want that change to happen. Next up, we're going to frame 22. This is where Max puts his finger to his face before he does the shush sound. Now let's go to 41. Here he takes the final step before he looks over to May. 65. This is where Max looks at us again after glancing at May. We had a golden pose there on frame 52, so we don't need a key pose on the performance here because it was a golden pose already. 74. This is the moment Max puts down the camera, so you need to set a key there to let the computer know. And then frame 77, here we have a facial change and Max is giggling here, so his entire body kind of goes up and down a little. So you want to key that change. And then 83 is the part of the giggle that we already had as a golden key, so we don't need to set a performance key on this because it was already a golden key. And so next up, we're going all the way to 138. This is again Max's eye darting towards May, and so it's a performance change. And then our next one will be at 170, and from 170 to 179, Max's hand goes up and down as he does the thumbs up. So if we go from here, you can see his hand is just going up and down doing the thumbs up. And so we have two key poses there on performance. Now we're going all the way to 335. And this is where Max does his yes gesture, and this frame is where his hand come closest together before opening up again. And then at 366 is where Max fully stands up. And lastly, on frame 430, this is the last pose of the camera before dropping down. Okay, so now we have a lot more information and exactly 40 keys, but it's still not enough. Believe it or not, this shot is 420 frames long. This is excluding the camera falling to the ground. Now something else we have to do is to add the extremes. Extremes also belong under the key category, the key poses, but instead of describing the main motion, they act as anchors to pose right after a change of direction happens. I marked these anchors in turquoise so we can differentiate them from the rest. So let's go ahead and start with the first extreme pose, and that is frame 10. So from frame 1 to frame 10, Max is looking at May. Frame 10 is the last key before Max darts to look at us. So we want the key on Max's eyes so we're not slowly drifting towards us over those 10 frames. If we just had a pose here and then a pose here, the eyes will be drifting from the left to the right once we hit spline. But here we want to have a key on frame 10 before the eyes dart to the right, because that only happens in 1 to 2 frames, sometimes 3 to 4, depending on the look. Now on frame 41, this is the last frame of Max doing the shush pose with his hand and his expression before he turns away. So again, you need to key these areas to let the computer know to hold your pose. Now if we go all the way to frame 191, that's right here. This is a great example. From frame 170 or 171 to 191, Max is holding the same pose with just minimal motion. This is called a moving hold. Again, you want to set a key here on the entire body before the change of direction happens. Otherwise, the body would slowly drift towards the next pose. Now 210 is another hold here where we're just holding from 205 to 210 before stepping forward. The next one would be 258, where again, it's a moving hold. If you pay attention, we need to give the animation some pause to breathe before the next major action. And so this is the last pose before a major shift. And the next one being 276 here. Again, another moving hold here. Here the camera is just shaking and it's just Max basically staying in that pose with slight movement before changing directions of movement. And while I'm talking, I'm gonna leave this super stretching that's happening with Max on the screen so you guys can enjoy it. Look how stretched that head is. And so another role that extreme key poses play is marking down anticipation and overshoots on parts of the body, like here on frame 231. Before standing up, Max goes down a little bit to gather a little bit of energy, kind of like the squash exercise. As you can see, goes down to gather a little bit of energy before changing of direction happens. Otherwise, the body would slowly start drifting upwards in the next pose. And so he would just be going slowly upwards from this pose to here. This is kind of like the squash we did on the ball before it jumped into a spin in the advanced tail practice video. So here you can see Max's hand slowly going up until frame 265. This is in anticipation of blowing the horn. And then 292, the hand overshoots downwards, as you can see, and then settles back up into the golden pose that we have 3 frames later. So we have the extreme of the hand going down on frame 292, and then it goes into our golden pose that we created in the very beginning and settles there. Other things you'd want to key would be, for example, overshoots of parts of the body past the key position. Now we have an example here. If we go to frame 14, for example, here's an extreme pose that we made, but instead of going from the previous pose directly up, it first travels down first. So let's take a look at that. You can see that the eyebrows are going down here, and then they start going upwards into that key pose. And so we had the extreme of it coming down on frame 14 and then hitting this key pose on frame 22. I also want to mention that you don't have to be too specific when setting your keys. Sometimes it might be hard to tell which one is a golden pose or just a key pose or an extreme. Depending on the shot, it can be up to your interpretation. The main goal of explaining all this to you is for you to understand how much information you need to input. Of course, this wouldn't be an issue if you were doing hand-drawn animation, because in that case, you only get whatever you draw yourself. But in 3D animation, it might be tempting to let the computer do the work for you. The problem with that is that if you let it do too much, your animation will look floaty and oversimplified. You really want to input as much information yourself as possible. The goal of this lesson is to show you what information to keep in mind when setting your poses. And with that said, we can now move away from the keys and talk about breakdowns. Breakdowns are helper poses situated between keyframes, and they describe how the character or their body part gets from one key pose to the next key pose. However, they don't have to be exactly in the middle of the 2 key poses. Breakdowns play several roles, but these are the most important ones: arcs, favoring or eases, and visual interests. So let's talk about arcs first. Imagine you have a ball going from point A to point B. Obviously, both of these poses are key poses, but without any further information, how would you animate the path? The most obvious way that comes to mind is a straight line from A to B, which you'd also get if you let the computer do the work for you. And this might be what you want, but there's so many other options. For example, the ball could travel at an arc like this, or it could even travel along a squiggly line. Well, this is where you need to add a breakdown or two to fill in that information. Otherwise, you'll always get the most direct path from one point to the other. As we progress through the course, we'll talk more about how most things travel in arcs, both in real life and in animation. But what we need to know right now is that arcs are usually described through these breakdown poses, and you absolutely need to add this information if you want it to be included. So here are our breakdowns for the arcs. First one, we have frame 44. Here the head is traveling down on the turn, which is a trick we do a lot in animation to add interest, even though in real life this would be a lot less exaggerated. Next up, on frame 58, same thing. Let's go to frame 97, and here the upper body and head dip down before he pushes off. Kind of like the down pose on a walk cycle. It's just more interesting than a linear motion. Let me play this in real time to show you. So if you notice that, here the character goes down before going back up and taking another step. The next breakdown pose is 103. I'm not going to visually show all of them, but there's a breakdown on the arm. It travels in an arc, dipping down and going back up. 130. Again, the body and the head dip down before pushing off the foot and turning around to May. Let's take a look at that again. 145, the body dips down and then goes up a bit. Next up we have 162. Here there's a hand arc. Next up we have 239, and here the hand but also the body arc throughout here. And then last one would be 324, where the feet travel in an arc instead of a straight line across the floor. Next up, favoring or eases. Favoring is an idea that some parts of the body arrive at the next pose sooner than the others. There might be a body part that is leading the action and then parts that are dragging behind. You should always keep this in mind, because unless you're animating a robot, it would look unnatural if all body parts hit the pose at the same time. That's just not how humans or biological creatures work. But that is what would happen if you just have two key poses and let the computer do the rest. You'll get a robot motion. So again, we need to add some breakdowns to fill in this information. I'm just going to give you a few examples to drive the point across. So here, our first one is at frame 138. This is again favoring or easing. 138, the head is the first one to turn while the body is still rotated towards us, and so it's leading the action. If you pay attention here, the head turns and then the body follows. So we set a pose on 138 to showcase that the head turned first, and then in our back to our key poses, we have some key poses to indicate that the rest of the body turns afterwards. But right now we're just focusing on our easing and our favoring. And so here on frame 236, we're showcasing that the body is leading the action, the back becomes more hunched as the head and chest drag behind. The arms are dragging behind a bit here as well. And so we had our golden and key poses get us to this point. And so here we have a favoring pose where we're showcasing that some parts of the body are leading the action while other parts of the body are dragging behind. Now at frame 242, Max's hand that holds the air horn catches up through here quicker than the rest of the body. So it reaches that point and then the rest of the body slowly eases into that point. And our next pose is 283. The body is leading again. There is a big stretch and the arms are dragging behind a lot. Then we go on over to 301. The center of the gravity leads. Max is shifting his weight over one foot so the other one can lift off of the ground for him to take a step. You can see his core and his center of gravity just completely shifting to the right side here. moving his weight so he can lift off this foot right here. Our second last pose here is 328. Max's right foot was dragging, but now it has quickly caught up to land first and catch the body. And lastly, we have 359. The body is leading again and the hands with the camera are delayed, as you can see from the camera cutting off the top of Max's head. But then later it catches up and frames him properly. So essentially, there is a constant push and pull happening, with some parts of the body leading and some dragging behind, which makes the animation more dynamic and more interesting. And finally, in your reference, go in and see if there is any additional information you can add to push your animation. This can be finding frames where you can add a nice blink or head shake, push any squash or stretch that you find, break down the pose on the fingers to add some extra detail, and so on. Essentially, if there's anything fun your character does while going from one pose to the other, add that in there. Ideally, you want to keep breaking down the shot until you have set a pose roughly on every 4 frames of the animation, which seems to be the sweet spot where it's not too much or too little. At this point, you want everything that the computer can't predict to be included, because the last thing left to do are the in-betweens. These are the remaining keys that fill in the motion between all the keys and breakdowns. Luckily for us 3D animators, there isn't much we have to do when it comes to in-betweening. You actually do want to let the computer take over for this part. If you keyed every controller on every frame, then your motion path would most likely be jittery and the motion wouldn't look smooth. Plus, it would be a ton of work. If you are working in constant interpolation like we did in our robot walk cycle video, you won't be able to see the in-betweens until you spline your shot, and that's when you select all your keys, press T, and then change them to Bezier. Once you do that, you still want to make adjustments either by using the tangent handles, these things, by shifting the keys around, or by using Shift E and using the breakdowner tool to push eases where they need to be. Besides that, in-betweens are pretty straightforward. You have already done all the heavy lifting and don't have to think so much anymore. The storytelling is all there. Now you just need to make sure the motion looks smooth, which is quite easy in 3D compared to 2D animation, where every in-between has to be drawn by hand. Okay, we finally reached the end of the lesson. I know it's a lot of information and probably pretty overwhelming, but we're going to continue working with these concepts when analyzing our references and animating our shots. So you will get to see how this works in practice, and it'll hopefully start making more sense. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.